definitely say approach this book as understanding it's a big spin on the hero's journey. Hello, welcome to Books and Booze. This is a series where I talk about books and I have some booze. I'm Alex. This time on the channel I will be talking about Cities of the Plain by Cormac McCarthy, as I've been finishing off a couple videos here about the Border Trilogy. I'll also be sipping on some of this Dewar's French Cask Smooth series that they put out. It is, I think, Dewar's white label standard blended Scotch, but they end up finishing it off in Cask that originally had apple brandy from France in it. So before we get into it, salute, cheers to Cormac McCarthy. I have really been enjoying having the Scotch around during the winter season. Warms you up inside, but the apple flavor really does actually come through a pretty fair amount. So you kind of almost get this candied apple with like warm spices flavoring to it, and it really mellows it out. It's not super peaty like you get with a lot of other scotches, so I highly recommend it, and I especially highly recommend it for the price point. You can usually land that at like a $20-$25 bottle that is so worth it. I've been really loving it. Anyways, onto the book. Cities of the Plain is a 1998 novel by American literary titan Cormac McCarthy, and is the final volume of his Border Trilogy. So what it does is it follows the two characters that had their own standalone stories in the previous novels, starting with John Grady Cole in All the Pretty Horses and Billy Parnham in The Crossing. And at this, their kind of youthful wanderings, the coming-of-age stories that you were experiencing in those other two novels have kind of ended, and their stories are converging together as they're working on the same ranch right outside of El Paso. And we learn this ranch is kind of soon to be shut down, so they're kind of experiencing the last leg of this ranch before it's occupied by the United States Army. And similar to the other two novels, as part of the Border Trilogy, there are a lot of border crossings in this novel as well, as they frequent this whorehouse down in Juarez, Mexico. And there, John Grady falls in love with a teenage Mexican prostitute who also suffers from epilepsy. Then what mainly follows as the central tension of the novel is this quest that John Grady carries to marry this young girl and bring her back to the United States and have this simple ranch life with him. As you might expect with McCarthy, it doesn't go well. So I'm not going to repeat any of kind of the biographic or contextual information that I mentioned in my video on The Crossing. If you're interested in where these books align with McCarthy's life, go watch that video. But I did want to give a little bit of interesting background that I kind of noticed looking into this novel. And part of that is that I read that Cities of the Plain was conceptualized to be a screenplay. I can't 100% confirm that, but it would make sense with some of the criticisms I actually have of the book. And again, I think it's interesting that El Paso plays a pretty central role to the novel, which I'll dive into a little bit later, because he at least was kind of residing in that area during its conception. So I've kind of already alluded to by talking about the idea that this maybe was a screenplay at some point that I have some criticisms on this book, that I didn't dig it as much as I did the other two novels in this trilogy. And to my understanding, I'm absolutely not alone in feeling that way. In some ways, Cities of the Plain is a departure from the other two. I was a bit put off at first by how this novel zooms out from the detailed character studies that we got in the previous two novels, and instead Billy and John Grady are kind of more like archetypes now. They teeter on the line of caricature, but I'll stick with archetypes. John Grady is this young romantic cowboy who is a master at such a young age, yet he's kind of full of this ignorance to the world around him, and he's up and coming, at least in terms of his career. Billy, instead, is this broken loner who is also a master on the ranch, and he's cynical, yet he's kind of always aiming for honor, and he's just trying to do the right thing in a broken world. And you see this dynamic all the time in popular storytelling, because it really is a compelling relationship to watch play out between these two characters. But what I want to flag here that I kind of mentioned in the crossing videos that I think without the other two books, you wouldn't see these characters as very rich or even like nuanced or compelling, which is something I assumed that would happen with this novel when I was talking about it in my crossing video. I don't know if I would recommend reading this without reading the other two, to be honest. It moves so fast and it stays at kind of a surface level and it still pulls from those other books, but you completely miss any of the meaning and the fruition of a lot of the themes that this trilogy carries without knowing the other two stories that it's trying to reference. And that was sort of disappointing for me. I want to get even closer to these characters, but Cities of the Plain kind of keeps them at arm's length for you to a certain degree. And the same goes for new characters that are presented in the book as well. I mean, you can look at, there's a couple of pimp characters, and they are also just kind of this symbol of evil. There's not really a lot of detail or anything given to them. They just act as pure antagonist and evil. And the last thing I'll point out is my other major criticism is a lot of people regard the epilogue in this book as completely unnecessary, and I probably agree with that. I won't spoil anything at all in terms of the epilogue or the overall ending, but I thought the overall ending was very powerful and compelling, as opposed to the epilogue is just kind of this moment for McCarthy to explain some of his ideas that were presented in mainly The Crossing, but the trilogy in general. And it gets back into my only criticism I had of The Crossing, which was just, we get it, bro. I get what you're trying to do. You don't have to spell it out for me in this strange dialogue. I would just stop at the story's initial ending if you go and visit this book. To be honest, it's actually really great. But enough of the negativity. Let's talk about what I did like about this book. And I still enjoyed this book a lot, despite everything I was just saying there. That is in part because I read the other two books, and you get a ton more out of this. And I think you will find it more fascinating and enjoyable if you read the entire Border trilogy. Cities of the Plain continues to play into the theme about the cyclical nature of things, whether things are fatalistic or not, or at least that you can witness idealism as part of our combative nature to fate. And you can find honor in that, and these characters find honor in that. And that was a really interesting theme that kind of threads through this very devastating story. And I will say that this novel does so more or less in your face than the other two novels, in my opinion, because what it actually relies on is you reading the other two books, so you can draw connections to the imagery and relationships that are formed. John Grady falling in love with yet another tormented Mexican girl is probably the biggest and most obvious connection to All the Pretty Horses. But one of my favorite scenes occurs when Billy and John Grady are working to capture these wild dog puppies, and it's sort of this redemptive moment for Billy, and it doesn't feed that to you. You just kind of have to read into it and witness what's going on with his character in that moment, and it's really wonderful. And it's on a mountainside, no less. Again, you'd have to read The Crossing to make those connections. And one of the biggest things that this novel does is build out this rich history between ranch hands and the ranch owners, as well as Mexican locals in the El Paso area. The relationships, the dialogues, and the dynamics are more so what are rich in this novel than any of McCarthy's typical prose or kind of his description of imagery, which is another departure from the other two books, which lean more heavily into his skill set in that area. You see how these characters have matured or haven't matured, and the different implications of who they are based on the relationships they now hold. And I think if you get into this novel understanding it's going to be something more as an archetypical exploration of these themes and a sort of spin on the hero's journey, I think you're going to like it more. And that's what I would definitely say. Approach this book as understanding it's a big spin on the hero's journey. I think this is especially true the further you go into John Grady's rescue plan for the girl he falls in love with and the novel's climactic knife fight. I'll spoil that there's a knife fight. I won't say exactly what goes down, but it's an excellent climax of the story. It's a really good moment. And despite that other themes are maybe more in your face and heavy-handed, the cyclical nature, the fighting fate with idealism, trying to kind of forge honor in that way, are more in your face. I actually thought it was interesting that the biblical themes and implications of the book are a little bit more subtle. The title itself, Cities of the Plain, comes from Genesis 19, and I think it kind of invites you to think about that a little bit more clearly. It does not actually kind of point in your face about why McCarthy named it this way. If you're unaware, that is a reference to the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, and a lot of interpretations of that specific biblical story, even this, is that those cities kind of are these symbols of carnality and the pitfalls and evils that can occur with it. And I do think the ideas of carnality are certainly present in the novel, and you're kind of invited to explore that. But another way that it's often viewed with the Sodom and Gomorrah tale is just the unwelcoming nature that is instilled via carnality into the world. And that's kind of the overall unredemptive act that occurs in those cities. And it's really easy to view Juarez as the stand-in for Sodom and Gomorrah, but it's cities of the plain, not city of the plain. And so then I think you're actually invited to critically think about how El Paso fits into this as much as Juarez does. There is a carnality to the sense of both cities, just a very different kind. There is an unwelcoming nature to both cities, though it is slightly different. There is an idea that no one new can no longer exist here, that it's just this threshold for either pure carnality that kind of devolves into hedonism, or this idea that it's pure carnality that devolves into consumption and blind progress without any disregard for the people that live in the area. So be sure to keep that in mind as well, as there's kind of this more subtle line that goes through it against kind of all the more heavy-handed themes that you can experience in Cities of the Plain. So, do I give Cities of the Plain by Cormac McCarthy a toast of excellence? I think it is an overall excellent experience when placing it in the context of the entire Border trilogy. I am uncertain if I would be giving this a toast of excellence if I had not read the other two books, though, so that is my caveat. But absolutely, toast of excellence to Cities of the Plain. I recommend the Border trilogy overall. It can be belaboring with its themes at times, but they're pretty well developed throughout the entirety of the trilogy. And just McCarthy's prose is so damn excellent at times. It strikes me with jealousy that I didn't write some of these lines, and he continues to do that to me with basically, at some point, every book I've read by him so far. Cities of the Plain 2, I think, is an excellent capstone in terms of the overall plot of the trilogy, and it is devastating what comes to fruition, but it's absolutely fitting. That kind of sensation, I mentioned it with The Crossing, where it is devastating, but it just makes sense, and it's so well executed that you kind of love seeing it. And I do think that Cities of the Plain provides some pretty interesting evolution in terms of style, as it leans more into the dialogue and relationships than it does solely the prose and imagery and the interior monologue of these characters. Overall, I recommend all three books if you're interested in westerns or less conventional coming-of-age stories, or just brooding loners roaming dangerous plains and damned landscapes and dialogues about human nature, fate, metaphysical turmoil, and fighting suffering with idealism and hope, even if it dips into some kind of absurdism or faith at that point. So, depending who you ask. It's good stuff. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you've read the Border trilogy, any of the books at all, or Cities of the Plain, and you had a different experience, maybe you thought something a little bit different about what I discussed here, let me know in the comments below. I'd love to start a conversation about that. If you like book reviews like this, a little bit longer, a little bit more with an eye toward analysis and the themes, please consider subscribing and also seeing some of the other books I've covered on the channel. Also, if you like cultural analysis in general, I do make video essays, typically around movies, on the channel. I'm currently doing a lot around the idea of post-secularism, so be sure to check those videos out as well. If you like this video overall, let me know by giving it a like. If you didn't like it, let me know by giving it a dislike. I like to know either way. Again, thank you for watching this video, and cheers to Cormac McCarthy and Cities of the Plain and the Border trilogy overall. Excellent books. Thank you for joining me in this book review, and I hope to see you in future explorations.